Hi, I'm Makoa de Almeida, and this is my Robert Hooke and the Scientific Revolution presentation. So who is Robert Hooke? He was born July 18th, 1635, and died March 8th, 1673, at the age of 67. He was born in the Isle of Wight, England, which you can see in Figure 1, a very pretty coastal town. Um, his parents were John and Cecily Hooke. His dad was a clergyman, which is a priest, and Hooke had a son named Nanceman John Hooke, and he was the youngest child of 4 kids. Early life. Robert's health was very delicate for practically his whole life. Because of this, Robert wasn't a very active person and spent much of his time either at home or at school. Robert's dad noticed that he was very skilled at intricate work and was a very detail-oriented person. His dad had hopes that he would become either a clockmaker or an artist. At the age of 13, Robert's father passed away, leaving him a will of £40, which at the time was a large amount of money. In the same year, he went to the Westminster School in London, where he studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, and mechanics. At the age of 18, he got into the University of Oxford, where he majored in experimental science and was a member of the choir. Hooke became very good at working with mechanical instruments and eventually landed a job in the university as an assistant to one of the forefathers of chemistry, Robert Boyle. He was an assistant to Boyle for 7 years, where in that time Boyle created Boyle's Law, using equipment engineered and built mostly by Robert. In 1660, Boyle co-founded the Royal Society to help with the advancement of the scientific understanding of the world. 2 years later, Boyle helped Robert become the Society's curator of experiments. This was Robert's first job, and he actually moved to London from Oxford to pursue this career for 40 years, which was majority of his life. At the same time, major accomplishments. The Scientific Revolution. At the same time of Hooke's life, the Scientific Revolution was in full effect. This was a series of events that led to a rapid understanding and development in mathematics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, physics, and anatomy, which changed society's view of the natural world and how things worked. Of course, this had very strong contradictions with the church, which pretty much dictated how the universe worked at the time. The revolution took place in Europe close to the end of the Renaissance period and continued to persevere through the 18th century, having a big effect on social movements such as the Enlightenment. This time period saw an extraordinary change in scientific ideas, and this rapid collection of knowledge had never occurred before the 17th century. Major accomplishments include the Anchor Escapement. In the year of 1657, Hooke created the Anchor Escapement. This was a cog, which is a piece of a clock, as you can see in Figure 5, which gave a tiny push to every swing that the pendulum took. This prevented the clock from running down while simultaneously advancing the clock hands. 3 years later, he also created the balance spring, which is essential for keeping time in pocket watches. This spring was attached to a balance wheel which created a regular oscillation, which made clocks, and more specifically pocket watches, more accurate. In 1660, Robert Hooke created Hooke's Law. This is also known as the law of elasticity. Hooke was an English physicist, and his law stated that the tension force in a spring increases in direct proportion to the length it is stretched to. At 1665, Robert published a book called Micrographia, which became the first ever scientific bestseller. Micrographia has highlighted a lot of Robert's talents and specialties, including engineering, scientific instruments, his understanding of nature and light, and his art. Micrographia was super important to the scientific community, and our knowledge of nanotech, microbiology, and quantum physics have some roots from Robert's book. Compound microscope. Hooke made multiple improvements to the compound microscope before people needed to move the specimen to focus it, but Robert designed a screw focusing mechanism so that you didn't have to. He also created a design that used a water lens to focus light from a lamp to help illuminate the specimen under the microscope. With the microscope, Robert was able to discover a lot of new things. Some people couldn't even believe that they were real. In Figure 8, you can see some of these features, such as the water lens on the left-hand side, which used an oil light as its source of light, and the water lens to magnify that light. Discovery of microscopic fungi and plant cells. In 1665, Hooke discovered the first known microorganisms, which were microscopic fungi. Using the microscope, he also discovered the first cell by looking at the bark of a tree. Although he didn't discover the true biological function of the cell, he was the first to see and describe them. On Figure 9 and 10, you can see some of his illustrations. Hooke also used his microscope to study the ancient cells in fossilized wood. From studying this, he was able to infer that some species go through extinction and that fossils are the remains of living organisms that have mineralized. He was also 200 years early to the theory of evolution than Charles Darwin, and he was one of the first people to propose that species evolve over time. And in Figure 11, you can see some illustrations of his paleontology finds. As a side career, Hooke was also a well-known architect. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, Hooke helped to design many buildings to replace those burned down. He was appointed to be the surveyor to the City of London and actually became very wealthy from this position. In Figure 12, you can actually see one of the buildings designed by Hooke in Warwick Lane. Hooke was one of the first people to build the Gregorian reflecting telescope, which you can see in Figure 13. After building it, he was the first to discover the star cluster trapezium, which you can see in Figure 14. This cluster was the fifth one in the constellation Orion. He also was the first to suggest that Jupiter rotates on its axis, and he also drew very detailed sketches of Mars, which were used in the 19th century to determine its rate of rotation. He proposed that the force of gravity could be quantified by using the motion of a pendulum, and tried to show that the Earth and the Moon rotate on an elliptical path, and not spherical orbit around the Sun. Hooke also sketched very detailed illustrations of the craters on the Moon, which are all put into his book, Micrographia. Hooke versus Newton on light waves and particles. Hooke's rivalry with Newton began in 1772, when Newton put forth his first paper on optics to the Royal Society of Science. The basis of this paper was that light was composed of particles, and that white light comprised of the 7 colors in the visible white light spectrum. The Society denied his theory, and Hooke suggested that light was instead made of waves. Although Newton's particle theory of light was later accepted in the 18th century, Hooke still opposed it. The Society leaned more towards Hooke's wave theory because Newton's theory couldn't explain a certain phenomenon, which obviously created some tension between the two scientists. In the end, both theories were accepted in the 20th century, but neither of them got solid evidence for either of their theories. Hooke was both the one who disagreed with Newton and the one who instigated an attack on him, which created a lifetime of rivalry. A couple years later, Hooke publicly called Newton out for attempting to plagiarize his work on light, and for another couple of years, they sent each other vicious letters, basically dogging on each other's work and minds. Edmund Halley and Isaac Newton tried to find evidence to propose that centripetal force between two celestial bodies was inversely proportional to the squares of the distance between them. This was eventually proved by Newton and ended up being one of his most famous contributions, known as Principia, which you can see in Figure 16. This contained Newton's universal law of gravitation and had the 3 laws of motion, which most of you are probably familiar with. And this is the foundation for classical mechanics. After Halley to the Royal Society, Hooke spoke up and said that Newton had once again stolen from him, and that Newton had gotten the idea of the inverse square law from him, and that the completion of Newton's work would not be possible without Hooke's ideas. Although Newton had mentioned Hooke and others who had gave some input, he was very mad that Hooke was taking direct credit for his work. Despite this, Newton went on to publish his book, and that even though Hooke came up with inverse square law, he was the one who put forth the conclusive mathematical proof that Hooke could not. Even though Hooke is now a very famous and world-renowned scientist, history did not seem to favor him so well. An interesting fact is that there's not a single surviving portrait of Hooke from his lifetime. The only thing that we do have is descriptions of him from his contemporaries who described him to be a very pale, blunt, and grumpy man. Some historians think that the reason there are no surviving portraits of him is because of his tendency to get into nasty disagreements with fellow scientists, mostly famous Isaac Newton. Oh, yeah, that was that slide. Robert Hooke died at the age of 67 in 1703 due to ongoing health issues that had been troubling him for years. Hooke was a Renaissance man. He wrote one of the most important scientific books ever written and made many contributions of knowledge to society, including biology, physics, chemistry, architecture, astronomy, topography, and the development of scientific instruments. These are my references, and this concludes my presentation. Thank you.